Welcome back to the show as we continue our discussion on the hurricane that devastated New Orleans and parts of America's Gulf Coast 10 years ago. And welcome back to our guests. Richard, the administration of George W. Bush at the time of Hurricane Katrina was severely criticized for its handling of the crisis. Many felt that there was an inadequate response. There were also suggestions that race played a role in the government's response to this crisis. What do you make of that?
Well, you have to be inside the Bush administration to know these details, but it's very clear to me, Anand, that, this is not only to one administration. I think every administration could have had their Katrina, right? I mean, you think about every major inner city or any major city in the United States, whether it be Dallas, whether it be, New Orleans, whether it be Atlanta, whether it be Miami, whether it be Chicago, they are all one crisis away, one natural disaster away from what we saw take place in New Orleans almost 10 years ago, right? The ideal that there is structural income inequality, the ideal that a lot of places lack jobs, resources, infrastructure to deal with this type of mass casualty. That is the biggest problem. That is why you see folks on the street saying Black Lives Matter, because you saw it take place in Ferguson, where the innocent killing of a man resulted in the same sort of type of crisis. People, and I think that's like the larger context, right? I think you have to look at Katrina in context of where we are today and realize that indeed in this country we have a huge problem. Income inequality, the absence of industry, and the lack of jobs. If we can work on those things, right, we can really make America a better place. But this is what we saw in Katrina, was just peeling back the Band-Aid from what could be any urban city across the country.
Can I project this?
Go ahead.
Brown? Yes. First of all, I want to say my organization, National Action Now, they can go there. We have been actually, when you say the word race, let me just say this. Let me clear this up. White and blacks have been affected and have, been affected by this storm. I mean, I don't want to say that only blacks, because I have a lot of white people in St. Bernard Parish and on the lakefront and Lakeview area. They lost their homes, they lost loved ones. The impact, blacks felt the impact of the storm. But I'm saying that we don't want to make it look like the white community did not suffer. Everybody suffered. The black community got the most impact of the storm, and we still are feeling the impact. So go to my website, www.nationalactionnow, and get more information. But we need to understand that, we can talk about the racial composition. Yes, black folks suffered, but white folks suffered too. Hispanics suffered. Everybody suffered in this storm. Yeah. So I want to send the right message out there that yes, they could have done a better job in rescuing us. Yes, the governor of Louisiana, Kathleen Blanco, she was slow. She was ignorant. She did not really respond in a timely fashion 10 years ago. Now, today, we are still suffering. Please help us. Black and white, all races of people are suffering in the state of Louisiana and in New Orleans.
Right, and Gary, looking at things going wrong, we know that the levees failed in 2005. New levees have been built at a cost of billions of dollars, but we are told that these levees can withstand up to a Category 3 hurricane. They would not be able to withstand a Category 5 hurricane like the one that hit New Orleans. So all this money being spent, has the city been made safer?
Right. By the time Katrina hit New Orleans, it was a weak Category 3, strong Category 2. And yes, the levee system is rated for Category 3. The difference is the levee system collapsed. Half of the 350-mile levee system collapsed after Katrina. This system, people generally agree, is strong enough to withstand a Category 5. There will be overtopping. Water will come over it, but the system won't collapse.
Exactly.
But if I could get back to something, back to what the Reverend said, yes, everybody suffered, but the great crime of Katrina is the policies that were put into effect to help with the recovery favored the white communities over the black community. You have Road Home, the largest federal housing recovery program in U.S. history, $10 billion. Well, it was based on appraised value of a home rather than the cost to rebuild. 5 years after Katrina, a federal judge agreed with the plaintiffs who said this was a racially discriminatory way to do it, but by that point there was only about $150 million left. So you see Lakeview, a white prosperous community, is pretty much 100% back. But then you go to Pontchartrain Park, a black middle class neighborhood, is maybe 60%, 70% back 10 years after Katrina. Go to some working class neighborhoods, 7th Ward, for instance, maybe half back. And a lot of that was because of policy. I mean, some of it was the lack of wealth in the black community relative to the white community, but it was policy.
Jeanne, what about the fact that during, the height of Hurricane Katrina, there were so many black people who were displaced, and in the following years, I mean, looking at one figure here, the black population went down from 67% to 60%. Where did all those people end up?
There's a diaspora. They're all over the country. A lot of them stayed in Texas. A lot of them went elsewhere. There definitely have been demographic changes. I think your other guests who are on the ground in New Orleans probably know more about this than I do, but my understanding is that, for instance, the Latino Hispanic population has increased significantly over time. 2 points I'd make about race. I do think income was a huge factor. The people who I saw impacted by the storm that night were people who did not have the resources to get out, and the city had not made adequate provision to get them out. So that was one factor. But another thing that I noted the next day, it would have been the 30th, was a camaraderie amongst all races in the city. It was really quite amazing to me to see people who, I would guess, probably would not have had much communication or much to do with one another in the days prior to the storm, were reaching out to one another with a helping hand. Okay. Now, whether that lasted over time, I can't say. Your other guests would know better than I.
Let me just say, race, let me just say this to make it clear. Race played a role, but I don't think every white person, because a lot of donations and charitable groups, relief organizations were white that came in and gutted out all these homes. They were whites who donated money, time, and energy to help rebuild the city. Habitat for Humanity and the Lutheran churches came down and helped us. So to say that, yes, racism and the slowness of it played a role. I think that whites. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, Richard, go ahead.
Oh, listen, I agree with the Reverend, right? Like, there was a lot of charities that came in and they were a part of recovering the city of New Orleans. But I think the larger context here is that it wasn't necessarily people being racist, right? It was the ideal, the policies that they created had implicit racism in them. Right. A great example that you see is in how when they recovered the school district, right? So they got rid of all the neighborhood public schools. They brought in private companies to run schools. And now what you have is a situation where kids are still not getting the education they need to dream and achieve those dreams, because the current system of charterizing and privatizing and vouchering the entire New Orleans school system is not a solution. Okay. So when the money came in, because the money did come in from the federal government, from charities, the money was not distributed adequately to deal with the issues that still existed in still existed in New Orleans, rather, prior to Katrina. Okay. And I think that's a larger context of this.
Okay, I want to get a final word in from Gary. Gary, you mentioned those policies. Have they changed?
No.
No, I mean, there's 100,000 less African Americans living in New Orleans today compared to the time of Katrina, when it was a city of 455,000. The policies haven't changed. The Orleans Parish schools are still in the hands of the state, or most of them are, 10 years after Katrina. Public housing, there were big four public housing. Some of it flooded, but much of it didn't. It was never reopened. It was surrounded by a fence with barbed wire, and people, even though there was a desperation for affordable housing in those first years, it was just knocked down and never reopened. There's 18,000 people on the waiting list for public housing or Section 8 vouchers, and they closed the list 3 years ago. They estimate there'd be 50,000 if they hadn't closed the list. There's still a lot of suffering here.
That's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us.